very quickly, so I might speak a bit fast. So forgive me, and I'll try and do the best I can. But I'm going to be looking at earth grids and the enchantment of the landscape. Firstly, the second part of the talk is going to be my research into the strange giant skeletons and elongated skulls that have been found around the world. And it does actually, strangely, all kind of click together, as we'll see as we go through this. But firstly, I want to kind of give you a bit of background about myself and about why and how I got into this. Earth grids really are the study of the relationship of sites around the world, but also the natural geometries within the planet, which have an effect not only on us, but also on the entire landscape. And this, I believe, is something that John Michell was working on. Any of you know John Michell's work? A few of you, brilliant. Okay. This is very much in the line of John Michell. He was my kind of mentor, my kind of biggest inspiration, and so I kind of dedicate this to him. There's just my book, which you can get afterwards for £6. And this is John Michell here. He actually spoke at the sunrise celebration, the first ever sunrise celebration, and he's spoken at one of the green gatherings as well, the big green gatherings, many years ago. So you may have seen him here, you may not. You may have seen him at our Megalithomania conferences, but it was back in 1969 where he really put on the map this idea of this sacred landscape around the whole world, relating to megalithic sites, mounds, earthworks, obelisks and many other such sites. This is just a quote from his book, The View Over Atlantis, which you can gaze at for a moment. But it was his book called 12 Tribe Nations, The Science of Enchanting the Landscape, which he authored with Christine Rohn, which really kind of grabbed my attention a few years ago. And it made me realise that these sites may have had a more mystical purpose. And it was about kind of bringing this harmony, this kind of energy, and even the geometry would create this kind of harmony around the planet, not just within the local sites themselves and local sites that connect up with them, but also on a global scale. But before we get into that, there's just a few little definitions we're going to go through. Obviously, Sean Kerwin, he's been through some of these already. I don't know if you can see that or not, but obviously geomancy is one of the key principles here, which is something that Sean specialises in, which really actually means divination of the earth. It comes from the ancient Greek, but there's also traditions going back in China and other places, even in Arabia as well. Geodesy or geodesy, this is translates as division of the earth, really the measure and the representation of the earth. But it's Archeo geodesy which kind of grabs my attention. It really is like ancient sites and their relation to one another, whether astronomically, through orientation, or through positioning and measure. Geometry, obviously, we're surrounded by that, and sacred geometry is naturally, this comes into it, not just within the layout and design of the temples themselves, but also the relationship all around the world. Ley lines or lays, people get confused by this, so I want to just quickly explain this. A lay is really just an alignment of sites which you can mark on a map. And then you can go out into the landscape and walk it as well. This is something that Alfred Watkins came up with back in the 1920s. Then you have these earth energy currents, which I think Sean may have touched upon. And these are really yin and yang energies of the earth and a combination of the magnetic field. And these weave around like serpents, hence the tradition of dragons and serpents in many different ancient cultures. Telluric currents are linked with this as well, and these are more of the magnetic field, and these fluctuate at dawn and at dusk. But they go into spirals, which is some symbolism we find all over the planet. Great Earth circles are like a hoop, like an Ouroboros, all around the world, like a serpent eating its tail, going around the whole planet. So it's like a great earth energy current across the whole surface of the Earth, which reconnects to itself. Archaeoastronomy, obviously, this is the alignment and orientation of ancient sites with the sun, moon and stars at certain times a year. And it's almost like the ancients encoded sites to specific times a year and to other sites using astronomy. They even used it for navigation as well. And the earth grids really incorporates all of the above. But it's really the enchantment of the landscape I'm going to be looking at today, even on other planets. This is a representation of Mars, and they found that the most powerful volcano complexes, not just on Mars, but throughout the solar system on each planet, is always at 19.47 degrees above or below the equator, which, when you place a star tetrahedron or a tetrahedron in a sphere, where the points touch, which you can see just here on the surface, this is where this activity seems to occur, and you get the Olympus Mons volcanoes on Mars, which are very powerful, and also Hawaii, obviously on Earth as well. This just shows you the Cydonia complex on Mars, which shows five-sided pyramids and the famous face on Mars, not far from this 19.47 or 19.5 degree point. We also find increased solar flare activity happens at 19.5 degrees, 19.47, and also we do find dark spots on Neptune, and with thin white bands of clouds going around at that particular latitude. But we also find these on Uranus's moon. This is really odd. You find these hexagonal and pentagonal shapes here, and also these triangles just on one of the moons of Uranus. Kind of really grabbed my attention, but this did as well, because this has actually been in the news recently, that there's this great hexagon which is twice the width of the Earth, sits stationary, fixed to the planet itself at the North Pole, and as the Earth, as it rotates, as Saturn rotates, actually maintains itself. It's like some kind of energy signature coming out the top of the planet, maintaining this particular geometry. Oh. And you can see this here as well. Here's just a close-up, and it shows you the cloud bands as they move around that particular geometry at the North Pole of Saturn. Even the aperture of Saturn's moon has this strange ridge going all the way around it. It's like a great Earth circle, kind of the whole exact right through the equator as such of that particular moon. There's no way that could really be there unless it was kind of built, and it is about 10 miles or 12 miles tall and the same wide, so it's pretty strange how that could even get there. So there's lots of anomalies in the solar system. Oops, wrong slide. This is the one I wanted. This is kind of fascinates me. This is actually the Earth when viewed from above. It's actually a quote that Plato said really caught my attention. The Earth when viewed from above resembles a ball sewn from 12 pieces of skin. Now, the only geometry, spherical geometry, that has 12 pieces like that is a dodecahedron. And we can see that here, that when you place the dodecahedron in the Earth, the sides of it go exactly along the mid-Atlantic ridge, almost like the Earth is forming with a dodecahedral system within it. Let me just show you a couple of geometries here so you know what I'm talking about. If you're not aware, this is a dodecahedron here with 12 faces. This is an icosahedron, 20 triangular faces. This is a cube. This is a tetrahedron, and this is the octahedron. And these are all also represented in these stone spheres that were discovered in Scotland within some stone circles going back 5,000 years ago. So they were using these different platonic solids, these different geometries, these spherical sort of geometries way back thousands of years before Plato was even born. So we do find this a problem. We can't really call them platonic solids anymore. And this just shows you one that resembles a dodecahedron. Some tape's been put on it here just to give you some clarity on that. But there's different geometries in the Earth as well, and I'm always interested in the effects that you can actually find on the surface. Now, this is the most interesting one, really. This is an icosahedral system, but this wasn't realised until much later, when Ivan Sanderson, who was a brilliant researcher in the early 1970s, was looking at different disappearances and strange anomalies and time dilations in the Bermuda Triangle. But you realise there were other areas around the world that had these strange things going on, including the Devil's Triangle off Japan, even Hawaii and Easter Island, and many other places. And he plotted these around the world and called them the Vile Vortices, or the 12 Devil's Graveyards, because it also includes the North and South Pole. And what he didn't realise is that he came up with this, which is each one of those points is a vertex or point of the icosahedron, the 20 triangular faced polygon. And these just show you where the points are here. And they match pretty perfectly. This just shows you a close-up of the where the Bermuda Triangle is supposed to be. It's almost like the triangles, smaller triangles, form at the vertices or the points. This just shows you what it looks like when you overlay it in Google Earth with the red one is the prime meridian, the ancient prime meridian, which we'll talk about later. But even in the also in the early 70s, a very strange discovery was made by a bunch of Russian scientists, which was actually recorded in a scientific journal. And this is their representation of what they believed the Earth, energetically would look like. They actually believe, this was published in this very sort of famous Russian scientific journal, but they believe the Earth originally was a great crystal, like a geometric crystal at the centre, and over millions and billions of years, Earth would be attracted to it from the solar system, and that's what created the Earth. And they believed, these scientists, that basically on the surface of the Earth you could still detect where these energies were, and hence this idea of a grid. And this is their final analysis they eventually kind of came up with, which you can see combines various different geometries, which was the basis of the Becker and Huygens grid, which we'll look at shortly. This just shows you the combination in Google Earth. This just shows you what an icosahedron would look like over the Earth and where the lines would join up. And at the same time this was happening, you got to understand this was all happening separately at different areas around the planet, different researchers coming through with this. This one really caught my attention. Well, this is the work of Bruce Cathy, who was actually an airline pilot in New Zealand, and he realised that he just kept seeing hundreds of UFO reports, but because he was a pilot, he mapped exactly where they happened and what direction and orientation they were going. When he mapped them all together, eventually he realised they formed a grid over New Zealand like this, like a north-south grid, and they only moved along these lines. They didn't move anywhere else. There was no diagonal movement. It was always this particular grid. And strangely, this matched exactly what a researcher in France called Michell was researching, where he found a grid over France, which is almost exactly the same. Again, UFO flight paths. But the weird thing is, it was actually based, when you put it all together around the Earth, it was actually based on a cube and octahedron. So we're looking at different geometries again within the Earth and their kind of energy systems that occur on the surface. This just shows you the octahedron in yellow combined with the icosa and the dodecahedron. It starts to get a bit confusing after a while, but there is a pattern here, and it's always linked and fixed with the magnetic north poles. This was later worked on by William Becker and Beth Huygens, who came up with this. And they basically worked with the Russian model, and they were actually professors at a university in New England, and they actually got all their students to do all the hard work. And this is one of the first maps they came up with of the whole planet, where they combined all these different geometries, all the research of previous people, but they felt there was something missing, like a structural kind of integrity of it. So they looked at Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome designs, and using his synergistics too, combined with the 5 platonic solids, they came up with this, which suddenly everything kind of slipped into place. There's land masses here, which form around grid points here as well in Australia. Bermuda Triangle, obviously we've got Hawaii and Easter Island as well. So we're looking at all the different systems slotting into place. This just shows you the European version they came up with. This one here particularly interests me because this is very close to the St Michael line. I'll just let you gaze upon that for a moment because there's quite a lot going on. They basically just joined the dots, just to put it bluntly. But these are the main points here. This just shows you, again, the whole system completed over Google Earth. Each of the colours represents different geometries and their sort of effect upon the surface. This just shows you Britain. Again, you can actually do this yourself in Google Earth. You can actually type in Beth Huygens, B-E-T-H-E, Huygens, and you can actually find this particular grid, and you can actually overlay it over Google Earth's KMZ file, and you can do each of the different geometries one at a time to sort of see where your house fits onto it and which geometry you live on. It's pretty interesting and nerdy once you get into it. This just shows you one of their original maps over North America. Again, it just shows you the Bermuda Triangle down here, one of the main points. This is a very interesting area as well. There's an ancient civilization called the Hohokam, and they built all these megalithic canals all over the landscape down here. There's also a sacred cactus down here, which I'm sure they partook in. But also, this is an area which is famous for these red-haired double rows of teeth giants, which we're going to talk about in the next segment. This just shows you one of the faces of the grid over the Americas, and you can see it's centered kind of on the Bermuda Triangle, but it goes way down into Peru, Brazil, Bolivia, Costa Rica, etc., with Florida kind of here. And on the right-hand side here, we have that face, really. This is what the face kind of looks like. And when you combine all these platonic solids and you put these strengthening ribs in from the Buckminster Fuller's work, you get something called a rhombic triicontohedron. Yeah? Remember that. I'm going to test you later. And this is like a sort of a strengthened icosahedron, basically. But again, we see examples of dodecahedrons here. This is actually a Roman one found in France. These are the ones found up in Scotland. You can see these beautiful carvings here, these spiral carvings. Very grid-like, this one. These are the 5 platonic solids, but there were several found which show combinations of the icosahedron, a combination of the cube and the octahedron, and so on and so forth. So even back 5,000 years ago, Northern England and Scotland, we were very advanced spherical geometry was obviously being taught at these stone circle universities, as some people call them. But this kind of fascinates me because this is a whole other dimension of the way they were thinking and the way they were working. These are kind of handheld, so they were kind of like teaching tools. Archaeologists believe they were hunting projectiles to either hunt really stupid people or animals. I'm not sure, but it doesn't really make sense to me. But when Keith Critchlow, who was the master geometer who kind of put all this together, combined all these stone balls that were found all over Scotland, he came up with this. Now, this is exactly the same as the Becker-Hagen's grid we just looked at. It's exactly the same format. So by combining all these megalithic spheres that were discovered, this is what he came up with, which matches the grid. So that I kind of think is a brilliant coincidence. So that gives you a quick outline of the grid. I'm moving pretty fast, I told you I would. But I want to get into some sort of strange anomalies and coincidences around the planet. There's quite a lot of those going on. This is just one example here, just if you're interested. This is really about distance. This is Newgrange in Ireland. If you draw a line between Newgrange in Ireland and the Great Pyramid at Giza, and you continue that all the way around the world, that length there is exactly 1/10 of the planetary circumference. So somehow between Newgrange and Giza, they knew, or it was a lucky coincidence, that it was 1/10 of the planetary circumference. And we have a good example of orientation here. This one kind of really grabbed me because I've visited both these sites. This is Newark Earthworks in Ohio, in America, and this is obviously the Great Pyramid. But these are like 3,000-year-old earthworks. This is about almost a kilometre long. It's so big, they built a golf course inside it. And this is a perfect circle in this octagonal shape. Each of these lines here follow the 18.6-year moon cycle very accurately. So it's an astronomical calendar as well as being a brilliantly designed geometric earthwork. This is only one small part of it, but you can see the clear orientation here. It's very interesting. Actually, if you continue that line 6,000 miles, it hits the Great Pyramid exactly. So whether that was deliberate or whether they were revering the ancient Egyptians when they built this, no one really knows. But even the measurement systems within the Newark Earthworks actually encode the same kind of number systems, geometry and mathematical measurements as the Great Pyramid. So again, we have to look at these correlations as well. I mean, this is the part we were just looking at. This shows you the full scale of the entire complex. This was almost a kilometre long. These are megalithic, these are earthen walls that were kind of built, really beautifully done. You can still visit this part today and this part here. This part's about the same size as Avebury, with massive ditches and banks, which the manpower to sort of build this whole construction was quite remarkable. Hardly anything's left. They built a whole town over it, unfortunately. But you can still visit parts of it. So we've seen Giza to Newgrange is 1/10. But if you draw a line between Avebury and Newgrange, with the two biggest megalithic temples in Britain, really, it's 1/100th of the planetary circumference, exactly, from the dead centres of them. Giza to Newark, already mentioned that. And if we go from Avebury, say, to Chichen Itza, which is this pyramid site in Mexico, it's 72 degrees away of a 360-degree circle, which is 1/5 of a circle away. So we keep finding strange anomalies like this. This is one I just found out, I discovered recently when I was playing around with Google Earth. There's a site here called Göbekli Tepe. We're going to look at that in more detail later. This is an ancient megalithic sort of temple site with stone circles, about 40 stone circles, stretched over about 2 miles square. They were using 50-ton blocks. But the weird thing is it dates back between 12 and 14,000 years ago. And there's beautiful relief carvings, 3D carvings, stunning geometries, artistic, amazing artistic kind of abstract style. 7,000 years before the pyramids were built. You know, we're looking at, you know, when the pyramids were built, this place was ancient. And they actually used it for about 2,000 years, this place, and then completely, deliberately covered it up. And it only got found again in the 1990s. Amazingly. So, but the weird thing about this is that it really puts on the map this whole Atlantean kind of idea that there were sites, civilization going back at least 10 to 12,000 years. But if you draw a line between this and a major temple site in the centre of Cuzco, the Coricancha, which is, you know, the ancient Inca and pre-Incan empire, they're both the names Göbekli Tepe and Cuzco both mean navel or belly. You know, they mean the centre, like the axis mundi. That's the actual name of them. Yeah, and if you draw a line between them, it's 7928 miles, which is the exact equatorial diameter of the planet, which has been known about for, you know, a couple of hundred years. But this wasn't supposed to have been known about back then. This is like several thousand years ago, obviously. Interestingly, John Michell and others believe there was an ancient canon of numbers which were used throughout the world in prehistoric times. And these always get reduced down to these canonical systems, and this would be 7920. So this is where you start getting into the mathematics, which is probably not a good idea on a Saturday night at a festival. But if you do, say if we say it's 7920, only 8 miles off, it's 8 times 9 times 10 times 11 miles. So this is the way they worked in prehistoric times. So the surface distance between Göbekli and Cuzco is the equatorial diameter right through the middle of the Earth. Exactly the same measurements, if you're into that kind of thing. Another interesting one here, this is Giza. This is Giza pyramids here, and this is the unfinished obelisk down in Aswan. This is about several hundred miles away. But interestingly, I was doing some research for a series of articles for this website, ancientorigins.net. This is actually the obelisk here. It's about 1,140 tons, which is pretty big. It's carved out of solid granite, which is pretty much the second or third hardest stone on the planet. Diorite is one. This is actually another quarry. This is actually the Göbekli Tepe quarry. Some of the stones still in situ here. But it's this one here that grabbed my attention, because if you draw a line between that and Giza, the exact distance is 365.4 nautical miles, which means they were measuring the quarry to the Giza pyramids precisely, sort of marking these different these number systems. So 300 nautical miles. Basically what airlines use, it's what the military use. It's basically the exact circumference of the Earth divided into 360-degree divisions, and that's broken down further. But we know they were doing this kind of thing in prehistory, because there's not only are there sort of brief mentions in some ancient texts. This one is the most compelling one. This is from the Book of Enoch, which was rediscovered just a couple of hundred years ago, where they were clearly saying that they were kind of flying around the world, measuring. I'll just read this out to you if you like. And I saw in those days how long cords were given to the angels, and they took themselves wings and flew, and I went towards the north. And they asked an angel, saying unto him, Why have they taken cords and gone off? And he replied, They have gone to measure. And these measures shall reveal all the secrets of the depths of the earth. Now, the Book of Enoch is supposed to be from the Old Testament, or even earlier, which is potentially 4 to 5, even 6,000 years ago. And so we're looking at a very ancient prehistoric survey of the entire planet, which I believe this is part of the enchantment of the world back then. They were building these sites, they were working with the native civilizations, teaching them all these arts and sciences on a global scale to bring harmony and a good vibe really to their cultures and to others. So I find that particularly interesting that you even get mentioned in the Book of Enoch. Even ancient maps reveal that they were around the whole planet going back thousands of years ago. The Pires Res map, this is quite a famous one. This Turkish admiral in the early 1500s, he compiled many ancient maps from the Great Library of Alexandria in Egypt before it got burnt down. and created what's called the famous Pires Res map. And here, this kind of showed coastlines of virtually all the world, going back many thousands of years, which suggests this was being done at least 5,000 years ago. And the Orontius Finicus map is even more interesting, because this was found a few years later, compiled a few years later, and it shows the entire coastline of Antarctica, which is now mostly covered in ice and has been for 10,000 years. And so somehow, pre-10,000 years ago, they were mapping the world accurately, and yet this isn't really mentioned at school or university or in any history books, but there's a lot more to this than meets the eye, especially now Göbekli Tepe has been discovered. We know that it's pretty much confirmed now that the ancient sort of prime meridians, they would have had to have a prime meridian, they would have had to have a north-south line from the north to the south pole. Now it goes through Greenwich, but ancient times it used to go through Giza, or later it went through Alexandria, which is slightly northwest of Giza. This just shows you a map which I believe they were working with in ancient times. And if you go east and west from Giza, you find major megalithic temple sites all around the planet are actually precisely kind of almost lined up to this Giza meridian. Here's just some examples here. This is actually lifted from Graham Hancock's book Heaven's Mirror, and it shows you how when you divide the 360-degree circle or sphere up into different divisions, we find these harmonic numbers. And what's really interesting is that Graham Hancock believed these were precessional numbers. They were encoding the precession of the equinox, a 26,000-year cycle. But actually, when you look at a pentagon, the internal angles of the pentagon, actually, you find the same numbers. And so, hidden within just a simple kind of hand-drawn geometry here, we'll find the secrets of how they laid out these sites around the planet and within the sites themselves. It's pretty strange that there's a sort of link between this precession of the equinoxes and the internal angles of pentagons. It's pretty bizarre when you start getting into it. This just shows you a list of sites east and west of Giza, which show you how far they are away when using degrees of the 360-degree circle. And these are just sites, forget Giza, these are just sites, how they relate to each other, distance between them. You can see there's some pretty interesting examples, pretty interesting numbers keep popping up. Now, numbers, you're thinking, why the hell is he talking about numbers? It's Saturday night, I'm at a festival, what are you on? Well, basically, I believe that this number system was actually a kind of, more than a system, it's like a language of the ancients. It's the only way we can understand how the ancients were thinking. Because all these languages come and go and they get lost. Even the hieroglyphics we can't understand. The earliest temples in Egypt had no hieroglyphics. There was no written language like we see today when the Pharaonic age started around 3100 BC. Before that, there was none. But there were these massive, sophisticated, incredibly perfect temples all over the planet, especially in Egypt at that particular time, and previously at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. And I believe these numbers systems were there as a language, and we just have to know how to read it. It's almost like when you arrive at a site, if you know how to read that site, if you know what to count, what order to count them in, how to mathematically kind of work the numbers against each other, you can find a hidden message there. Now, this is something called Archeo Cryptography, which was devised famously by Karl Monk, but there's a couple of other people who were doing it long before him. And so it's really important to know where you are on the planet. Say if you were surveying the planet, you were going around the world, you were this sophisticated elite priesthood, astronomer group. Each of these sites, even just a single standing stone or stone circle or a pyramid or a mound or whatever, there's always codes there to find. And each of these sites represents where it is on the planet within its structure. For instance, if you kind of go to Chichen Itza, you can count the amount of steps, the amount of pillars there are there, and you can divide them against each other, and that will give you where you are on the planet. It sounds very strange, but this has been pretty heavily decoded by Karl Monk. This just gives you an example of what I'm talking about here. This is here's just the side view of the Earth as such, and this just shows you that Giza is 30 degrees above the equator. This one's interesting for me, because if you divide this quarter of the Earth into 7 parts, which is, we know they were working in sevens back then, Avebury is 4/7 up from the equator, and Luxor in Egypt is 2/7 up from the equator. Also, we have this is actually Luxor, or Thebes as it used to be called. the main centre here. This is the 2/7 point. Even 3/7 up from the equator, we have Delphi, which is a famous oracle site in Greece, which potentially, as you can see from these megalithic polygonal wall, they now believe is much, much earlier. Even at 5/7, we find this strange area in Iceland, which has very... it talks about this sort of legend associated with it here that John Michell talks about. So we do find these correlations, but we'll look at Avebury shortly because it's very specific. Let me just talk about that now, in fact. Just jump back a sec. Oops. So we have Avebury here, this area here. This just shows you a representation of it there. Within Avebury itself, the position of it on the planet is 4/7 up from the equator. If you divide 360 over 7, you get exactly 51 point so. You get exactly its latitude on the planet. So just by its position on the planet, you can work out where you are. There's also some strange angles of the earthwork around Avebury, the major sort of ditch earthwork. If you divide these different lines up, it's mentioned in my book actually, my Earth Grids book. The angles between them divided equal the exact location where it is on the planet. So we do find these. They're pretty hard to work out because so many sites have been so badly destroyed. This just shows you a great Earth circle I was looking at because we mentioned Delphi and Giza, the Preseli area and Stonehenge. If you draw a line between Preseli and Stonehenge and continue it around the world, it goes through all these other sites. So Preseli is where some of the stones from Stonehenge came from, which is pretty strange in itself. And again, even when we go back to North America, this is a place called Portsmouth in Ohio. This just shows you an artist's representation of the earthwork. There's about 20 miles of mounds form this complex, but this is what the earthwork. This is what the earthwork looked like. You can see this great circle with these sort of strange avenues. This is about 4 miles long, and here you get this on the bottom corner. And look at Avebury. This is made of earth. This is made of stone in Avebury, which is virtually exactly the same kind of strange serpentine, whatever it is, symbolism. But why are you getting this in North America? The only thing left really are these two little horseshoe shapes in this. We went there in September 2012, and it's just a load of drunks hanging about in this yard or whatever. But this is again, these are mostly gone as well, these stones, but they almost look exactly the same. What are they doing there? Stonehenge has got some very strange stuff associated with it. It's a unique, you may not be aware, but Stonehenge is like a unique stone circle in Britain. There's no other stone circle like it. There isn't anymore. There was like this whole different kind of rough-hewn stone, or rude stone monuments they used to be called, where they would have rough stones, they wouldn't shape and cut them and sort of place them together so accurate. This is the only one in Britain that does that. No one kind of really realises that. It's a completely different design. It's like a different bunch of builders came in and created this incredible temple. But what they did do is align it with the other stone circles around the whole country and the world. Here's just one example, the way they kind of mark sites across Britain. This is the work of Robin Heath, who used to speak regularly at the Big Green Gathering, actually. This just shows you Arborough, Bryn Cellidu. This is up in Anglesey here, and Stonehenge. And this is pretty accurate. The same kind of earthwork with stone structures in the middle. It creates a 3-4-5 triangle, which again is a Pythagorean triangle, which wasn't supposed to have been known about till several thousand years later, i.e. Pythagoras himself. There's more. We find this as well. We've got the 3-4-5 triangle here, but also we've got a 5-12-13 triangle down here. This is the famous Lunation Triangle, which this is Stonehenge here. This is the Bluestone site where some of the stones from Stonehenge came from. This is Lundy Island, which actually Lundy translates as elbow. It's like a corner, and that's actually what it means. We actually went there with Robin Heath and a bunch of lay hunters back in 2008. We actually found a stone circle on the island that was partly buried, that had never been recorded before. And this was just a few years ago. So this is what's happening now. There's stuff being discovered, and it marked almost the exact spot of where this Lunation Triangle should be. Now this is the line. If you draw a line along here, This goes all the way around the world, like a great earth circle. It goes through Giza, Mecca. It goes all the way back, and it goes through some of the Archeo Earthworks, including Serpent Mound, and through Ireland as well. But strangely, this, if you actually go into Stonehenge, there's 4 station stones. Where are they? There, and there. And actually, there's actually this triangle within Stonehenge itself, marked by some stones, which are used to measure the different moon cycles, like we saw at Newark. So we keep finding all these correlations. But strangely, if you enlarge this lunation triangle, which is marked by these stones here, I can't see them on this picture actually, by 2,500 times, then you get this. It's almost exactly, and weirdly, the distance between Lundy and Stonehenge is 123.4 miles, 123.4 miles. Whether that's a joke, I don't know, but that's what they deliberately. It's almost like it, and what they found as well at the Bluestone site, the very earliest part of Stonehenge, underneath where all the other stones were put, they found chippings of these blue stones within most of the holes the big stones went in, almost like they were trying to tell you something, that this is where they came from, you know, before even the main blue stones were put there. There's a whole selection of bluestones. There's even actually a bluestone trilithon, which got knocked over, and you can't see it anymore. There's actually a stone, I don't think I've got a picture in here, which shows you this incredible workmanship on it, which is quickly got covered up, but luckily a few photos escaped of that. This just shows you Robin Heath's brilliant illustration of this, how they all sort of link together. I'm very impressed by these discoveries, as you can see by my nerdy excitement happening. But interestingly, this line here as well, this is a very important alignment, this one. This is also this line here. Now this was some research by Peter Knight, which he called the Wessex Astrum. Oh, pardon me. And you can see Stonehenge kind of almost goes through Glastonbury, Brockley, I don't know where that is actually, Avebury, and some other sites. But this line here, between Stonehenge, this goes all the way up to the Bluestone site. And this is the Lunation Triangle within this strange, what Peter Knight calls the Wessex Astrum. So we keep finding these weird patterns, whether it's just the nature of reality, maybe the Earth kind of talks to us like that and we get influenced by nature to build things in certain places, or it's a very specific, accurate layout design. Again, this just shows you this line here, which kind of goes around the Earth here. Just another example of that. But yeah, talking about enchantment of the landscape, which is really, you know, John Michell and Christine Roan's brilliant kind of concept, which I kind of really adhere to actually. They worked on something called the Circle of Perpetual Choirs, which is something our good friend Giles has been studying as well. Potentially there's an eastern circle of perpetual choirs which is still being worked on. But it's this one here, which is the most important one to me. It's Glastonbury, Stonehenge. You have many other sites. You have the Malvern Hills, Whiteleaf Oak right in the middle. And it's believed that each of these sites around this huge, great circle, there'll be constant chanting throughout, you know, for hundreds of years possibly. There'd always be some people chanting at one of the sites. So there'd always be this sort of, almost like this sort of vibrational energy field emerging from this. Whether it was here, whether it was here, whether it was there, it doesn't matter. But it kept happening. It went on potentially for hundreds of years. There's even, I've even found some research in Egypt where it's thought that at pre-dynastic times there was a same kind of principle where they would constantly chant and sing at sites non-stop. Like it just went on eternally, essentially. You know, that's what they were kind of talking about, to maintain this enchantment. And now what's being realised, thanks to multiple research, Paul Devereaux one of them, is that they found that many of these sites, if not most of them, are designed acoustically. They're almost like each site is designed precisely to acoustic principles and built accordingly. And people thought it just chants when they would go in and find all this resonance when they were chanting or testing out their equipment or you know, xylophones or whatever they were using, but they realized that they've been designed with that in mind, specifically the human voice. And so this idea of enchanting the landscape was actually part of the construction of the sites. Do you understand what I'm saying? So there's actually more to these sites than meets the eye. They were built with this in mind. There's also, like, I always question the placement of sites. Was it very accurate surveying, or was it based partly on intuition? Now, something happened a few years ago which kind of made us sort of rethink this whole idea when I was working with Sean and several other people. John Martineau and others were involved at the previous Big Green Gathering site back, I think, in must have been 2005 or something. We built this stone circle, a whole bunch of people, you know, very accurately. The whole site was surveyed. There was a whole John Martineau team of geomancers and astronomers involved, etc., etc. And we ended up actually conveniently going in the field where we had this tent, so that was handy. Then a few years later, we built this. Well, Sean really built this wood henge at the Sunrise Celebration site, which has now been demolished. Unfortunately, didn't last very long, but. You know, a few years later, Sean sort of thought, hang on a sec, I've never drawn a line between the sites I've been building. And he drew a line between them. We got online on Google Earth, and it goes directly through if you draw a line between it goes directly through the tower of Glastonbury Tor. Now, it wasn't planned, it wasn't arranged, and these were really kind of, you know, intuitively placed at the best spot you could find on that particular site. Because obviously, the best spot may not be on the Big Green Gathering site, but we had to make do. So we find that very interesting that suddenly we had this revelation. This is how the ancients may have been doing it. They were placing these sites purely on intuition, almost like internal guidance, telling them where to put it. It wasn't all about working out where to put it with your mind. There was other forces at work, and I find that really, really compelling when you start looking at sites around the world. Yeah, this is the famous Michell line discovered by, again, John Michell, back in the rediscovered by John Michell in the late 1960s. This just shows you, just gives you an idea of what we've been working on. This is the Michell line. This is actually the grid, this one. The lighter tone is the grid. This is something called the E line. There's the Belenus line. There's a whole bunch of stuff in Scotland. This is the Apollo-Athena axis here, the Rose line. And you can see where... Well, see just tons of stuff there, really, can't you? But it's as you probably heard me speak about this before, or read Hamish and Paul Broadhurst's brilliant book. This is a couple of energy lines they discovered weave around like a caduceus around this particular straight line alignment. This goes back to the 80s when they did this. They dowsed all this, and you can see the way these lines. So they're two different, like a male and female energy current, the Michael and the Mary currents, kind of weave around each other all the way up this whole part of the world, which kind of really fascinated me. So me and Sean decided to sort of extend that, see if it goes anywhere else around the world, and lo and behold, it went through one of my favourite places, the Island of the Sun on Lake Titicaca in Peru-Bolivia border. And this is a straight line alignment. If you just extend the straight line around the world, it goes right through the middle of the island. And even these same energy currents sort of meet at the north and south part of the island and come back in together when you get on the mainland. This is actually one of the dolmen sort of stones it goes through. This is just behind it, which looks like some kind of strange evidence. It's actually called the Rock of the Cat or the Rock of the Puma, but to me it looks more like a frog. And there's another energy line as well that goes around the world, and this is interesting. There's an ancient tradition in Peru and Bolivia about Viracocha, who was the great creator god who was supposed to have emerged from Lake Titicaca on a raft of serpents and created the great Viracocha or Tiahuanacan civilization way before the Inca were even known about back then. And he was said to have taken this path heading northwest from the area and going southeast as well and northwest, this particular alignment. This is actually Tiahuanaco in Bolivia, and you can see some people say this looked like a sort of square Avebury, because when it was originally, I don't know if you've seen Tiahuanaco recently, but when it was originally found, it was like a square circle. Doesn't make sense, that square stone circle, stone square even, and it had 99 stones in its perimeter. You also get 99 stones at Avebury as well. Which is kind of a nice little coincidence. This is supposed to be the great god Viracocha with his two staffs, which is something we find in other cultures around the world, like a Long Man of Wilmington as an example. And then we had a little play when we were working on all this research for my Earthgrids book. We came up with this. We actually decided to go back to 10, 12,000 years ago when the poles were in a slightly different place. The Earth actually had a sort of crustal shift 10, 12,000 years ago, according to Charles Hapgood, and even Albert Einstein backed up his theory. And this is like 30 degrees off where the pole is now. This is actually in Hudson Bay. And this, so we decided to sort of lock the grid into the old poles to see if any of the really ancient sites would sort of actually be on this particular grid. And lo and behold, there were quite a few. Kalanish is one of them. Göbekli Tepe clearly is another. Baalbek, Nabta, this is one of the oldest stone circles in the world in southern Egypt. Easter Island, Teotihuacan in Mexico, and multiple other sites, even Lhasa in Tibet as well. So we found this interesting. Even if you sort of replot the grid based upon the old magnetic poles, you find correlations. This is actually Göbekli Tepe. I just wanted to show you this because this just shows you just a couple of photo of what's been discovered there. These are the kind of pillars. Some of these are 18 foot tall. They're pretty big. Well, not quite as big as Stonehenge or anything, but they are 6,500 years older. But you can see these very strange designs. It's made to look like there's two stones, like there's a top and a bottom part, but it's actually one large stone, perfectly chiseled and cut with these relief carvings which basically pop out of the surface, and a kind of, so they have to carve all around them. And this is, remember, these are the earliest stones they found at the site, and these are 12 to 14,000 years old. This is insanely old. This is older. This is beyond the sort of end of the last ice age. We went there a couple of times with Graham Hancock and Andrew Collins. Andrew Collins has written a brilliant book called Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods. If anyone wants to know about Göbekli Tepe, that is the book to get. And Graham's writing his next bestseller. It's called Magicians of the Gods, based on his research all around the planet. And even in this is 6000 BC, they found these strange goddess figurines that show elongated skulls. So even in this part of the world, we do find this. We do find these strange skulls, which we're going to look at in the next part of the talk. So basically, I'm kind of going to quickly kind of close this part of the talk and move on to the next bit. But I just wanted to give you some indication of what the ancients were really up to. They were much more sophisticated, much more strange and intuitive than we can really understand. They were working with stone in a way we can't even comprehend today. Some of these stones, they were moving and shaping and lifting and carving these beautiful things in Egypt and Göbekli Tepe and other places. They had some kind of will, some kind of technology to be able to do this. And they did it all with precision to create this harmony, to create this enchantment that wasn't there just for their generation, it was there for future generations to enjoy. And I think this is one of the key principles, is that I think the Great Pyramid is probably the best example of this. Is if you want to kind of leave a book, like a knowledge book for future generations, you don't write it on paper. You don't even carve it on walls because you're not going to understand it. You actually build it into the site itself. And therefore, you have to use mathematics, you have to use geometry, you have to use measurement systems, you have to use systems that are universal, that won't change wherever you go in the universe. They're going to be the same in any time. These principles don't change. So that's why I think it's very smart to get yourself into the numbers, get yourself into the metrology, the geometry, the measurement systems, and actually use your intuition to work out what's going on with these sites, because there's a lot more to these than meets the eye. And you can see here, just all around surrounding, we're looking at some beautiful examples of sacred geometry. So yeah, so this is just this is actually the end of that talk. I'm going to go straight into the next one, so no breaks. Anyone interested, we're doing a conference in London on the 15th of November. I've got some flyers, actually, I'll dish out if you like. With myself, Robert Temple, and Irving Finkel, Andrew Collins, Brian Forrester and others. We've got quite a cracking lineup at the Steiner House in London. You're welcome to come along. You can check out my websites here as well. I've got a few books and DVDs with me, but we'll deal with that at the end of the next segment. Ooh.
Debt Free TV, in association with GetOutOfDebtFree.org.